Fluorescent lights hum over Seattle General in Atlanta, casting sterile blue across linoleum that smells like disinfectant and coffee 3 hours past fresh. Megan O'Brien moves through the ICU at 11:41 p.m. with the efficiency of someone who has triaged under mortar fire, her hand steady as she checks for drips, her movements economical in a way that looks like fatigue but is actually combat discipline. 8 months of night shifts. 8 months of keeping her head down. 8 months of being invisible. She wears scrubs 2 sizes too big, hair pulled severe into a bun that doesn't move, no jewelry except a medical alert bracelet she never takes off, the kind that lists allergies that don't exist, a placeholder for an identity that officially died 2 years ago. When she reaches for a patient chart at the nurse's station, her sleeve rides up revealing a thin surgical scar that runs from wrist to elbow, the kind you get from shrapnel when a Black Hawk's rotor wash doesn't quite clear the RPG fragmentation pattern. She pulls the sleeve down without looking at it. Muscle memory. The scar is old information. In her locker, tucked inside her jacket lining where nobody looks, is a faded unit patch, green and black, frayed at the edges, faded to the color of old money. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Charlie Company. The only physical proof of a life the Pentagon erased. Her eyes touch it once during her 10 p.m. break, the way a widow touches a wedding ring she hasn't worn in years. Then she closes the locker and walks back to the unit. Room for 47 sits at the end of the corridor, its for pump clicking its mechanical rhythm every 3 seconds. The patient inside arrived at 6 a.m. via life flight from some classified location the chart only calls training accident. Green Beret named Davis. 26 years old. Chest wound, extensive. Morphine drip at 2 milligrams every 4 hours, his pupils dilated wide enough to lose entire conversations in. His chart lists no emergency contact, no family listed, no military affiliation noted, which means the Pentagon doesn't want anyone asking questions about how a special operations soldier got a hole in his chest at a training site that doesn't officially exist. Megan pushes the door open at 11:52 p.m. and immediately notices 3 things. The blood pressure cuff needs recalibrating, his left arm is positioned wrong for someone in genuine pain, and his tattoo. Block letters. Capital M, capital O, capital B, Valkyrie 6. The call sign tattooed on his own skin like a prayer he doesn't remember making. She feels her breath catch, just once, just the space between heartbeats, and then her face becomes a perfect blank screen again. Hey, Davis slurs from the bed, his eyes tracking past her face without landing. The morphine has him floating somewhere between consciousness and the Hindu Kush, between room for 47 and the firefight in the mountains where everything went wrong. You the night nurse? Megan O'Brien, she says, keeping her voice in the register she has cultivated for 8 months, soft, deferential, the vocal equivalent of Scrubs 2 sizes too big. Not quite a question mark at the end, not quite a statement. Just a name delivered like an apology for existing. She reaches for his wrist to take his pulse, and her fingers brush the tattoo. His skin is warm. Still intact. Still breathing. The Brian, he mumbles, his eyes closing. The morphine is doing its job. His heart rate is elevated but holding, his breathing steady if slightly shallow. She counts 78, 79, 80 beats per minute. Regular sinus rhythm. Good. The wound site is clean under the dressing, no signs of infection, no seeping that would indicate the sutures are compromised. She notes everything in her head the way she used to note fire positions and enemy movement, precise, detailed, the kind of attention that has kept people alive in circumstances where attention was the only currency that mattered. How's the pain? She asks, her hands already moving toward the 4 monitor to check the morphine drip rate. Fine. I'm fine, he says, which is what men always say when they are not fine. His eyes flutter open briefly, searching her face like he is trying to remember something from before the morphine started rewriting his neural pathways. Do I know you? I doubt it, Megan says, and her voice is steady as surgical steel. She does not tell him that she carried his body 6 miles through enemy territory in the Hindu Kush 3 years ago, that she felt his heart beating against her spine when she was moving through the mountain passes with his full weight across her shoulders, that she left a piece of his uniform behind in the rocks when the extraction Black Hawk came down. She does not tell him that she has been waiting for him to show up somewhere long enough to let her know he survived. Try to rest. She documents his vitals on the electronic chart: BP 118/74, heart rate 80, O2 sat 97% on 2 liters nasal cannula, temperature 98.6. Normal. Stable. The kind of numbers that look like safety on paper. She notes the time, 11:54 p.m. She notes his pain level, 3 out of 10. She notes his mental status, drowsy but arousable, which means the morphine is doing exactly what morphine is supposed to do. She does not note that she is holding her breath. She does not note that her hands are moving on their own while her mind is somewhere else entirely. Dr. Mercer arrives for morning rounds at 6:17 a.m., his white coat pressed sharp as a threat, his shoes so polished they reflect the fluorescent lights like mirrors. He is 53 years old and carries himself like a man who has never once questioned whether the room should bend to accommodate his presence. His name is embroidered on his coat in silver thread. His stethoscope costs more than Megan's car payment. She sees him before he sees her. She always does. She is checking the 4 line on room for 43, a post-op patient recovering from a routine cholecystectomy, when Dr. Mercer rounds the corner with his entourage, a resident, 2 medical students, and a nurse practitioner named Chen who walks 3 steps behind him like a court attendant following a monarch. Mercer's eyes scan the unit the way a predator scans a savanna, cataloging movement, calculating hierarchy, determining which creatures deserve his attention and which ones are simply part of the landscape. His gaze lands on Megan for approximately 1.3 seconds. She notes this the way she notes everything, with precision, without emotion, filing it away in the part of her brain that processes threat assessment. In that 1.3 seconds, she watches him see a competent night shift nurse without credentials, without the MD after her name, without the institutional permission to do anything but follow orders and document what doctors decide. He sees someone whose hands are steady but whose place is clearly subordinate, clearly defined, clearly limited by the structural hierarchy of American medicine where physicians sit at the top and everyone else exists in descending tiers of importance. He sees an absence of authority and assumes an absence of capability. He does not see the scars on her knuckles shaped like rifle recoil. He does not see the medical alert bracelet that is actually a classified government override code. He does not see the woman they called Valkyrie 6 in the Hindu Kush, the operator who could perform emergency procedures in the back of a helicopter while under fire, the captain who had kept 17 soldiers alive in circumstances where alive seemed like a miracle that couldn't possibly hold. "Good morning," Mercer says to his entourage, loud enough that Megan hears every word despite being deliberately focused on the 4-pump. "I trust the night shift didn't create any disasters. These things usually run smoother when the experienced staff are on duty." The students smile. Chen smiles. Mercer smiles like a man who has just paid himself a compliment and expects the room to applaud. He does not acknowledge Megan's presence with words or eye contact, which is exactly the response she has cultivated for 8 months. She hangs a new fur bag on room for 43, checks the flow rate, and moves silently down the corridor toward room for 47. Her shift is almost over. She will document her final notes, pass the patients to the day shift, and walk out through the employee entrance into Atlanta sunlight that never feels quite as clean as it should. But that wasn't the worst part. That was only the setup, the first act of a play that was going to require her to do something she promised herself she would never do again. Room for 47 is quiet when she enters. Davis is sleeping, his breathing deep and even, his morphine drip running at the correct rate, his vital signs stable and holding. She checks everything anyway, the chest dressing, the suture sites, the 4 placement, the monitor readings. All good. All exactly as it should be. She is writing his final 6 a.m. vitals into the chart when Dr. Mercer appears in the doorway with his white coat and his stethoscope and his complete certainty that medicine belongs to men with credentials and that everyone else is just waiting for permission to matter. "The Green Beret," Mercer says, not bothering to lower his voice even though the patient is sleeping. "I assume you've been monitoring the morphine compliance." "Yes, doctor," Megan says, keeping her voice soft, deferential, the vocal equivalent of stepping backward. Not quite a question mark, not quite a statement. Just an answer delivered like an apology for speaking at all. Pain is controlled. No infection at the wound site. Vitals stable throughout the night. Good, Mercer says, and he does not say good work, does not acknowledge her assessment, does not treat her careful documentation and 12 hours of vigilant monitoring as anything more than the baseline expectation of a nurse who exists to follow physician orders. He moves into the room and pulls out his stethoscope with the kind of theatrical flourish that makes it clear he is about to perform the real assessment, the one that actually matters, the one that only doctors are qualified to conduct. Megan steps back, her hands empty, her face blank, her entire presence contracting into something smaller than she actually is. She has perfected this. 8 months of practice. 8 months of making herself invisible in rooms where her visibility might raise questions she cannot afford to answer. She watches Dr. Mercer listen to Davis's lungs, check his wound dressing, adjust the morphine drip by 0.1 milligrams without asking the patient if he is in pain, and she keeps her breathing steady and shallow, the way she used to breathe in observation posts where moving too much meant giving away your position. Dr. Mercer finishes his assessment, pulls his stethoscope off with a satisfied expression, and turns to face Megan as if he has just remembered she is standing there. Continue current management, he says. I want wound checks every 4 hours. Document any changes. And do try not to exceed your scope, we can't have nurses making medical decisions in this unit. The words land like shrapnel, but Megan's face does not change. She does not flinch. She does not feel the hit. She simply nods, says yes, doctor, and documents his orders in the chart while he walks out of the room trailing his entourage behind him like a cape. In 3 hours, her shift ends. In 3 hours, she will drive home to an apartment that smells like nothing because she has no furniture and no decorations and no photographs of a life that officially ended in the Hindu Kush 2 years ago. In 3 hours, she will sleep in a bed that is not hers, in an identity that is not hers, in a world that does not know who she actually is. But right now, at 6:23 a.m., she stands in room for 47 and checks Davis's vitals one more time. His heart is still beating. His lungs are still breathing. His morphine is running at exactly the rate she documented. She reaches down and touches the unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, hidden where nobody looks, where nobody thinks to search, where it has waited for 3 years like a prayer she doesn't remember making. And then she walks back out into the fluorescent lights and the hum of the ICU and the careful invisible life she has built from the ashes of a woman the Pentagon erased. The attending physicians meeting happened every Thursday at 6 in the morning, before rounds, before most people understood that coffee was a food group and not just a beverage. Mercer arrived first, he always did, his leather portfolio gleaming under the fluorescent lights like something that cost more than Megan's car. She was 3 rooms away, checking Davis's post-operative vitals, when she heard his voice cut through the intercom, that particular timbre he reserved for making announcements that sounded like gospel truth delivered by a man who'd learned theology at Johns Hopkins. Gentlemen, we have a discipline issue on this unit, Mercer began, his tone the color of mahogany furniture and old money. The other physicians, Dr. Chen, Dr. Patel, Dr. Sutherland, shuffled papers in that synchronized way that meant they were about to hear something rehearsed, weaponized, delivered with the precision of a man who'd built his entire career on the assumption that initials after your name granted you dominion over people's lives. Nurse O'Brien has been overstepping her scope of practice, Mercer continued. Megan's hand stilled on Davis's full line. She didn't flinch. She didn't flinch because she'd learned in the Hindu Kush that flinching was information, it told the enemy where you hurt. Yesterday she questioned a medication dosage I prescribed. She claimed the potassium level was incorrect. She delayed administration. He paused, letting the implication settle like sediment in still water. I have a medical degree. From Johns Hopkins. I think we can agree that trumps a nursing certification. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with small betrayals, averted eyes, sudden interest in chart reviews, the sound of a pen clicking shut as if it could end the conversation. Dr. Chen cleared his throat. Nobody disagreed. Nobody said, actually, that medication error would have killed someone. That wasn't how hierarchies worked, and everyone in that room understood the rules of the game Mercer was playing. Megan finished Davis's vitals, temperature stable, oxygen saturation 98%, pressure exactly where it should be, and left the room without acknowledging the conversation happening 3 corridors away. But she heard it anyway. That was the thing about hospitals, sound traveled through the HVAC system like gossip through a small town, and by 8:30 that morning, the entire ICU understood that Dr. Mercer had gone on record, Nurse O'Brien was dangerous. She didn't know her place. She needed to be watched. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular loneliness of the night shift ending without resolution. Megan sat at the corner table with her sandwich, turkey, mustard, wheat bread, nothing that would stain her scrubs, and watched the morning nurses trickle in. Jennifer Matthews arrived first, still wearing her pediatrics badge even though she'd transferred to the ICU 6 months ago to be closer to her mother's chemotherapy appointments on the 4th floor. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. That was all the warning Jennifer needed. Within 4 minutes, the table had emptied. Chairs scraped linoleum in synchronized rejection, a sound like mutiny, like judgment being delivered silently, like 5 people deciding simultaneously that proximity to Megan O'Brien was a career liability. Jennifer wouldn't meet her eyes as she left. "We can't be seen with you," she whispered, low enough that only Megan could hear. "Mercer's been making calls. He told the CNO you're a liability. That you put patients at risk." The door closed. The break room became a small archipelago of silence. Megan continued eating her sandwich in mechanical bites, her jaw moving with the precision of someone performing a task that required no emotional investment. Only her left hand trembled slightly, a betrayal of muscle memory that recognized danger signals, that had learned in gunfire that still hands meant alive hands. She pressed her palm flat against the table and held it there until it obeyed. 2 days later, the unit board in the hallway became Mercer's canvas. The marker was red, medical emergency red, code blue red, the color of consequence, and his handwriting was physician precise, each letter executed with the care of someone who documented everything for court. Megan stood in room for 47 checking Davis's chest dressing when a nurse named Patricia came to find her, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who'd been elected to deliver bad news. "He wrote you up again," Patricia said. "Public board. Full unit sees it." Megan's hands continued their work, peeling back sterile gauze, assessing the surgical margins, finding the edges of healing tissue that shouldn't be there. "What was the infraction?" "Pain medication. You gave it 5 minutes early. Protocol window is 30 minutes, but he's saying that's a deviation." Patricia's voice dropped. "It's your second one. The third one triggers administrative review. And suspension pending investigation." The words landed in the space between them like stones in still water. Megan didn't respond. She simply finished the dressing change, disposed of the gauze in the sharps container, the hiss of air escaping, the small mechanical certainty of something dangerous being put away, and walked to the unit board. The red marker words were large enough for families to read: Incident Report, M. The Bryan, undermining physician authority, chain of command violation. Below that, in smaller letters, CNO notified. Personnel file flagged. Further violations will result in administrative suspension. The signature was Mercer's, dated that morning at 6:15. Her pen moved across the acknowledgement line without trembling. Her signature was steady and deliberate, a name she'd learned to write in a different life, in a different uniform, in a place where your name meant something you couldn't tell anyone. She handed the form back to the unit clerk and walked back to Davis's room, her face the professional mask of someone who'd learned that composure was a weapon, that stillness was a form of resistance, that the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Davis was sleeping, his morphine drip humming softly, his forearm tattoo visible above the blanket edge. The name M. The Bryan was etched there in ink that had to be older than his military service, a call sign from before the deployment to the Hindu Kush that had brought him here, to her care, to this moment where he didn't recognize her and she'd become someone everyone else in this hospital wanted to disappear. But that wasn't the worst part. For days into Mercer's campaign, while Megan was restocking the medication cart on the second floor, Davis's alarm began screaming, not the gentle reminder of a pulse ox dropping, but the full orchestral panic of a pressure sensor registering critical failure. The sound is what every nurse hears in her sleep afterward, a wail, a siren, a voice that says, "Come now. Come fast. Come before the body decides it's done trying." Megan was in room for 47 in 11 seconds. She knew this because her watch read 11:23 and her brain had already catalogued 14 separate pieces of information before her hands reached the bedside. Davis's chest wound had dehissed, sutures separating, tissue tearing open with that awful soft sound like fabric ripping underwater. His pressure was dropping in real time, 90, 85, 80. His lips were going grey. His eyes were closing. She grabbed a scalpel from the sterile tray. Not thinking. Knowing. Muscle memory didn't ask for permission, it simply moved. Her left hand found the torn vessel inside his open chest cavity, her fingers applying pressure with the precision that comes from having done this before in darkness, in blood, in the back of a Black Hawk with insurgents firing at the rotor wash and a man dying while you held his chest together. Davis's pressure climbed, 85, 90, 95. Stable. The monitor stopped screaming. Mercer arrived 30 seconds too late, his face cycling through colors, first white, then red, then something darker that looked like rage trying to wear a physician's authority like a suit that no longer fit. "What the hell are you doing? Get your hands out of his chest." But Megan's fingers were already clamping the bleeder, her other hand reaching for suture material a resident handed her without being asked. She didn't respond. She didn't explain. She simply continued her work because that was who she actually was when the world stopped watching and started dying, and some people understood that without needing an explanation, and some people never would. In Davis's morphine-clouded awareness, something surfaced, a memory, a voice, steady hands holding pressure on his chest while 6 miles of mountain trail passed beneath them. He tried to focus on her face but the drugs pulled him under and the memory receded like smoke. Megan withdrew her hands, stepped back, let the surgical team take over. Blood to her elbows. Face expressionless. Breathing controlled. Mercer scrubbed in with shaking hands, his portfolio forgotten on the counter, his Johns Hopkins credentials suddenly very quiet in the presence of something that transcended every credential he'd ever earned. Davis's chest wound open clean as she peeled back the surgical dressing. Megan's hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, once in a forward operating base in Paktia province, 3 times in the back of a UH-60 Black Hawk, and now in the sterile quiet of Seattle General's ICU. The incision was healing exactly as it should. No signs of infection. No fluid buildup. She checked his pressure. 88/56. Stable. His vitals traced steady lines across the monitor, green mountains of oxygen saturation, a rhythm that belonged to the living. "You're doing good, Davis," she said quietly, and his eyes flickered toward her name badge without recognition, his mind still caught somewhere between the Hindu Kush and pharmaceutical fog. She had learned long ago not to wait for him to understand. Understanding would come or it wouldn't. Right now he just needed his wound cleaned, his dressing changed, his body guided through recovery by someone who knew exactly where every organ went because she had seen the moment his were almost rearranged by shrapnel. She reached for fresh gauze. Antiseptic smell, sharp, clean, the same smell as every hospital in every country. The gauze came open with a soft whisper of sterile paper. She was 3 seconds into the dressing replacement when his pressure dropped like a stone falling through water. The monitor didn't beep. It wailed. The number flashed red, 42/18. Then 38/15. His eyes went wide, the morphine suddenly burning out of his system as his body understood what his mind couldn't process yet. Something was catastrophically wrong. "Davis, stay with me," Megan said, her voice exactly level. She moved to the bedside in one fluid motion. His chest was the problem. The surgical site. She could see it now, the wound beginning to dehiss, the sutures separating as something internal gave way. Blood pooling. not the clean surgical bleed of a controlled field. This was a rupture. This was catastrophic. The code button was 3 feet away. She didn't move toward it. She moved toward the sterile field instead, her right hand finding the scalpel in one motion, muscle memory, the kind that lives in bone and doesn't require thought. The blade was still sharp. It had to be sharp. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She cut. The second incision went exactly where it needed to go. Left anterolateral thoracotomy, precisely at the 5th intercostal space. The anatomy was the same whether you were in Kandahar or Atlanta. The ribs. The pleura. The heart sitting in its cage of tissue like a bird that had forgotten how to beat. She placed her hands inside his chest and felt what had happened, the pulmonary artery hemorrhaging into the pericardium, the sac around his heart filling with blood, compressing, squeezing the life out of him one compressed second at a time. Megan clamped. Her fingers found the vessel and held it the way she had held it before, with the absolute certainty of someone who had already watched a man die when she wasn't fast enough and had no intention of repeating that mistake. His pressure jumped. 54/32. Not good. Not alive. But possible. The monitor climbed. 62/38. She could hear Mercer's footsteps now, the sound of him running, the code blue alarm pulling him toward the ICU like a siren call. But she was already inside. Already controlling the bleed. Already doing the thing that hospitals had written entire protocols against, that medical boards had licensing statements forbidding, that took a moment of 3 seconds to learn and a lifetime to earn the right to perform. His oxygen saturation edged upward. 71, 76. 81, the rhythm on the monitor shifted, the desperate fibrillation smoothing into something that resembled a heartbeat. Not normal. Not healthy. But heartbeat-shaped. Living-shaped. Mercer burst into the room, already reaching for a code cart that wouldn't help now because the crisis was already being managed by hands that had done this in a helicopter at 3,000 feet with the ground spinning below and ammunition popping like fireworks in the darkness. His face went white when he saw her. Hands inside Davis's chest. Scalpel in a tray. Her face focused with the kind of absolute calm that only comes from having already died once and decided not to do it again. "Get a surgical team down here," Megan said to the ICU nurse frozen by the door, her voice not a request but a radio transmission, the kind of communication that moves bodies without requiring permission. Level 1 rapid infuser. 2 units O negative. Page cardiothoracic. Now. The nurse moved. Everyone moved except Mercer, who stood there watching a nurse, just someone he had systematically humiliated for 6 months, operate inside a human chest cavity with more precision than he could manage with a scalpel and 10 minutes of prep time. Megan's breathing stayed controlled. Her hand stayed steady. She maintained pressure on the hemorrhaging vessel and looked at Mercer for exactly 1 second, her eyes the color of someone who had seen the worst and was no longer afraid of consequences. "He codes again, I do this again," she said quietly. "Do you have a problem with that?" The room went dead silent. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped its steady confirmation. The 4-pump clicked through fluids like a countdown clock ticking toward either salvation or catastrophe, and there was nothing in between. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Mercer. The worst part came 30 seconds later when cardiothoracic appeared, Dr. Patricia Hayes, the chief of surgery, a woman who had trained at Johns Hopkins the same year Mercer had and remembered him as the resident who'd lost 3 patients to infections he'd hidden from the hospital board. She took one look at the situation, the clean repair, the controlled bleed, the vital stabilizing, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition. Not of the procedure. Of the level of execution. "Who's managing the bleeder?" Hayes asked, already moving toward the bed. "Nurse O'Brien," someone said. Hayes stopped. She looked at Megan. Actually looked at her, seeing something that Mercer never had, not a nurse, but a skilled clinician whose hands had already saved a life that morning while Mercer was still drinking coffee and planning his documentation strategy. "Step back when you're ready," Hayes said to Megan. It wasn't an order. It was respect. Megan transferred the pressure management to Hayes's hands without breaking rhythm, withdrew her own hands from Davis's chest with the same precision she'd entered it, and stepped back one measured pace. The surgical team took over, and the crisis transformed into a controlled emergency, terrifying but manageable, the kind of situation hospitals were built for, staffed for, funded for. The kind of situation that most people survived. Megan stripped off her gloves. The latex made a snapping sound like a gunshot in the quiet aftermath. She didn't look at Mercer. She didn't have to. She could feel him standing there, his entire institutional power structure suddenly made irrelevant by the fact that a nurse had just performed a procedure that required not a medical degree but something deeper, the kind of knowledge that lives in muscle and nerve and the part of the brain that doesn't care about credentials when a heart stops beating. She turned toward the sink to wash her hands, her movements deliberate and calm. The water ran warm. The soap smelled like the same antiseptic that had filled every operating room she'd ever been in, whether they had walls or not, whether they had anesthesia or not, whether anyone official was watching or the only witness was a soldier with his eyes closed and his life balanced on the edge of a decision someone made in darkness years ago. Behind her, she could hear Mercer breathing. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could already see what was happening in his mind, the calculation, the realization, the slow understanding that he had just watched someone operate at a level he would never reach, could never reach, not with all his credentials and his politics and his carefully built reputation for authority that meant nothing when the alternative was death. Davis's pressure stabilized at 92/48. His oxygen climbed to 94. The monitor settled into something approaching rhythm. And in a sterile field where a nurse had just saved a life with a borrowed scalpel, the real emergency was only just beginning. The staff lounge smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. Megan sat on the edge of the vinyl chair in the corner, the one nobody wanted because the back was cracked, and scrubbed Davis's blood from beneath her fingernails with methodical precision. Cold water. Surgical soap. Her hands moved with the same deliberate control she'd used to pack field kits in darkness, every motion economical, nothing wasted. The blood spiraled down the drain in pink ribbons. Her nails were clipped military short, calloused from years of work that officially never happened, and under them was the residue of what she'd just done, saved a life the only way she knew how, the way you save lives when your hands are the only instruments available and a man's chest is coming apart in front of you. 30 minutes had passed since she'd walked out of room for 47 with Davis's heart beating beneath her steady hands, since she'd released control to Dr. Mercer and the crash team that arrived too late to help. She hadn't trembled then. She wouldn't tremble now. The protocol violation was already forming in her mind. No one authorized a nurse to perform surgical intervention, especially not a field thoracotomy, especially not with a borrowed scalpel and the kind of precision that came from doing it in the back of a UH-60 Black Hawk at 3,000 feet. She'd known it the moment the needle had punctured his pericardial sac, the moment she felt the relief of pressure releasing, blood pooling hot against her palms. She'd known she'd just ended her career at Seattle General before she'd even saved his life. But Davis's oxygen saturation was climbing, 88, 92, 96, and that was the only calculus that mattered. The door opened. Dr. Mercer entered with the chief nursing officer, a woman named Patricia Chen whose face had already arranged itself into an expression of professional concern that didn't reach her eyes. Mercer was carrying a manila folder thick with papers, his movements precise and deliberate, the gait of a man who'd already prepared for this moment. He looked almost satisfied, the way a hunter looks when he's finally cornered something wounded. Patricia closed the door softly behind them, the click of the latch sounding like a coffin closing. "Captain O'Brien," Mercer said, and the use of her rank, her actual rank, not her nurse title, felt like mockery. "We need to discuss what occurred in room for 47 this morning." Megan didn't look up from her nails. The blood was gone now. Only the evidence remained, the slight discoloration of her cuticles, the way her hands moved with military precision instead of the deference she'd practiced for 8 months. She placed her hands flat on her thighs and turned to face him. "The patient coded," she said quietly. I performed emergency intervention. You performed emergency surgery Mercer said, and he opened the folder with theatrical precision. Without physician authorization. Without proper sterile technique. Without departmental approval. I have already documented 17 separate protocol violations. He began reading from the papers, his voice taking on the sonorous quality of someone performing for an audience. Gross violation of scope of practice. Unauthorized surgical procedure. Failure to follow chain of command. Performing invasive procedures outside licensure parameters. Endangering patient safety through reckless action. Patricia's face remained composed. She'd worked at Seattle General for 14 years and had learned long ago that Mercer's documentation style was like watching someone build a house of cards, meticulous, impressive, and designed to collapse when the wind blew. But the wind never blew. The wind was institutional. The wind was bureaucratic. The wind was on his side. I invoked emergency medical necessity, Megan said. Her voice hadn't changed. Patient vitals were 0. No perfusion. 60 seconds from irreversible brain injury. You invoke the fantasy that you're something other than what you are, Mercer said, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd rehearsed this moment. A nurse. A very good nurse, perhaps, but still bound by the same restrictions as every other person in that category. The Joint Commission has specific protocols for code situations. The physician leads the resuscitation. The nurse follows orders. You decided you were the exception. He laid out the papers one by one on the small table beside Megan's chair. Each one was stamped. Each one was copied to administration. Each one was a stone in the foundation of what he was building, a mausoleum of bureaucracy designed to bury her career so deep that no one would ever find it. I'm filing an incident report, he continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of formal procedure. I'm requesting an investigation by the hospital's ethics committee. I'm invoking Joint Commission Regulations 3.2.1 and 4.4.7 regarding scope of practice violations. And I'm recommending immediate suspension pending the outcome of a formal inquiry. He placed the final document on top of the pile. This is all being copied to the Chief Medical Officer, the hospital administrator, and the State Licensing Board. Megan looked at the papers but didn't touch them. They felt heavier than paper had any right to be. They felt like the weight of 9 years she'd spent building a quiet life in the ruins of the one that had been erased, like watching someone methodically dismantle every wall she'd constructed to keep the military part of her away from the civilian part. The thing about bureaucratic destruction, she understood in that moment, was that it was far more effective than a court-martial. A court-martial was visible. A court-martial could be appealed. But paperwork was invisible. Paperwork was death by 1,000 forms, each one stamped and signed and copied and filed in triplicate. The patient is stable, Megan said. Because of luck, Mercer replied. Not because of your unauthorized intervention. Davis's surgery was successful. His wound closure was sound. He would have survived the bleed regardless of your actions. That was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it was a lie. But the truth didn't matter when it was written on 17 different forms and sent to people who'd never see Davis's chest cavity opening like a flower, never understand what it meant to have exactly 47 seconds before irreversible cardiac damage, never know the weight of someone's life balanced against the letter of a regulation. Mercer had built his case with the precision of someone who understood that institutions didn't care about the truth, they cared about documentation. They cared about paper trails. They cared about the narrative that could survive legal scrutiny. Patricia stood silently throughout the entire exchange, her face the carefully neutral expression of someone witnessing something she couldn't stop but could at least document she'd witnessed. Megan recognized that look. She'd seen it before on the faces of officers who watched bad decisions get made and understood that speaking up would only add their names to the casualty list. When Mercer finished, when he'd placed the final document on the pile and closed the folder with the finality of a coffin lid, Megan stood without being dismissed. She walked past him toward the door, and for just a fraction of a second, not long enough to be called trembling, just long enough to be human, her fingers hesitated on the door frame. For the record, she said, and her voice had changed in that moment, dropped into a register that came from a part of her that predated the scrubs. The patient's ejection fraction was 13% when I opened his chest. The hemorrhage was from the internal mammary artery branch. No amount of luck closes a vessel that's been severed at the root. And you know that. She didn't wait for him to respond. She was already out the door and moving down the corridor with the kind of precision that made people step out of her way without understanding why. 3 days later, Megan stood in the hospital laundry room, a basement space that existed in a kind of fluorescent-lit purgatory, rows of industrial washers and dryers humming their mechanical litany. The air was hot and humid, thick with the smell of industrial detergent and the particular staleness of a space with no windows, no connection to the outside world. The hospital's pulse didn't reach down here. Down here was just fabric and heat and the sound of machines working. She was folding her scrubs for the last time, working through the stack with methodical precision. Navy blue with the Seattle General logo. One pair, then another, then another. Each one was folded the same way, sleeve to sleeve, hem to collar, the kind of precise geometry she'd been trained to perform in a different lifetime, folding field kits in darkness, folding tents in rain, folding hope into smaller and smaller configurations until it fit in a rucksack. The scrubs were still warm from the industrial dryer, and the heat felt almost kind. Almost like forgiveness, though she knew that wasn't what this was. The termination letter had arrived on hospital letterhead that morning, thick cream paper with an embossed logo. The chief medical officer had signed it himself, which meant Mercer had escalated it all the way to the top, had convinced someone 3 levels above him that this wasn't just a personnel issue but a liability issue. Gross violation of scope of practice, the letter read. Pattern of insubordination. Failure to follow chain of command. Immediate termination effective end of shift. It was dated 3 days earlier, which meant they'd already decided before the incident report had even been filed, which meant this wasn't about what she'd done, it was about what she was. It was about a woman who'd stepped outside the boundaries they'd drawn for her and the efficiency with which they decided to remove her. Mercer had delivered it personally at her locker that afternoon, his expression arranged in professional regret that didn't reach his eyes. He'd looked almost sympathetic, almost like he was sorry that hierarchy existed, that there were rules that had to be followed, that she'd forced his hand. "You brought this on yourself, Nursey," he'd said. She'd seen him do that before, deflect accountability by suggesting that the person being destroyed had somehow orchestrated their own destruction. It was a defense mechanism for men who couldn't live with the damage they caused. She'd taken the letter without speaking, folded it once with the same precision she was using on these scrubs, and placed it in her bag. Then she'd come to the laundry room, this basement space where no one would see her leave, where the machines would murmur their mechanical indifference to her presence. Each crease was sharp, military standard. Sleeve to sleeve. Hem to collar. The fabric was soft from wear, broken in from months of night shifts and code situations, and the particular wear that came from hands that moved quickly and with purpose. These scrubs had held her through saves and failures, through quiet moments checking charts and loud moments running codes. They'd been her uniform in this life, the costume of someone trying to disappear into the role of quiet competence and professional deference. In the interior pocket of her jacket, hanging on a hook near the folding table, she could feel the weight of the faded unit patch, the only physical proof she'd kept from the life before. She'd sewn it into the lining months ago, right after she'd arrived in Atlanta, a superstition more than anything else. Something to hold on to when the walls felt too close. Something to remind herself that she'd been real once, in a way that went beyond scrubs and hospital IDs. The patch was from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, her unit designation from before the Pentagon had erased her, before Operation Brass Summit had gone so wrong that the only solution was to make everyone involved disappear. The Navy had been efficient about it. They declared her officially dead in every military database, buried her records under classification stamps, given her a new social security number and a stack of false documents, and sent her out into the civilian world to rebuild from nothing. 9 years she'd done this, 9 years of being a ghost moving through the world with a false identity, accepting abuse from doctors like Mercer because what was the alternative? Go public? Try to explain that her expertise came from places and operations that officially never existed? Megan placed the folded scrubs in the return bin, one stack on top of another, each fold sharp enough to cut. The bin was metal, institutional grey, the kind of container that was designed to be efficient and impersonal. She placed the final pair on top, smoothed the crease one last time, and kept her hand there for 3 seconds longer than necessary. The fabric was still warm. Her fingers pressed against the soft cotton as if they could somehow transfer warmth, as if the simple act of holding on longer might change what was happening. It wouldn't. By now, Davis was already transferred to the VA hospital across town. Mercer had arranged it personally, his documentation ensuring Davis was moved before he could connect the pieces, before the morphine cleared enough for him to really see the nurse who'd carried him through enemy fire. And upstairs, the ICU was running its afternoon census without her, nurses pulling her shifts, the machines keeping their mechanical rhythm, the patients arriving and coding and surviving or not surviving in the particular way that hospitals worked when someone decided you didn't belong there anymore. She picked up her locker key from the shelf. They'd given her 30 minutes to collect her personal items, and turned to leave the laundry room. The fluorescent lights buzzed their angry wasp sound. The machines continued their hum. Outside the basement windows, which were set high enough to catch only the lower halves of passing legs, Atlanta's heat shimmered against the concrete. Somewhere above her, in the building that had been her world for 8 months, something was happening that she didn't yet know about. Marcus was sitting in their apartment, the shadow box spread open on the kitchen table. Torres, the Marine veteran who worked security, was thinking about the wrongness of watching a nurse get fired for saving a patient's life. And Davis, lying in his hospital bed in the VA facility across town, was remembering fragments from the Hindu Kush, was seeing Megan's face in the operating room and finally, recognizing the woman who'd carried him 6 miles through enemy territory 4 years ago. But in the laundry room, there was only Megan, the return scrubs, and the weight of hospital bureaucracy settling around her like ash. She was gone in a way that had nothing to do with walking out the employee entrance. She was already a ghost, and not even the Pentagon had orchestrated this particular disappearance. The investigation moved like a glacier, slow and unstoppable, grinding forward on its own bureaucratic momentum. 3 days after Marcus carried the shadow box into Seattle General's lobby, IG Agent Patterson sat in a hospital conference room with Dr. Mercer's incident report spread across laminate like a jury verdict. 17 violations. Each one time-stamped. Each one cross-referenced. Each one signed by a man who believed his authority made his paperwork unassailable. Patterson was military intelligence, trained to recognize field medicine when she saw it described in hostile language. She'd served 12 years with Naval Medical. She knew what a combat thoracotomy looked like when it was written down by someone trying to make it sound criminal. Mercer shifted in his chair, his tailored suit suddenly too tight across the shoulders, his Rolex catching fluorescent light as he reached for water that tasted like copper. "Dr. Mercer, you wrote that Nurse O'Brien performed an unauthorized thoracotomy," Patterson said. Her voice was flat. Professional. The voice of someone reading facts, not accusations. "Can you confirm the patient survived?" "Yes, but that's not the point. Protocol requires." "And you documented that she administered medications outside the 30-minute window. Can you provide the patient harm reports for these incidents?" Silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Mercer's jaw clenched once. There were no harm reports because no patients were harmed. That was the architecture of his entire case, that procedural violations mattered more than outcomes, that hierarchy mattered more than results, that a nurse operating outside her lane was criminal regardless of whether the patient lived or died. Patterson pulled a different folder, and Mercer's face went the color of old bone. "Doctor, while reviewing your complaints, we noticed some inconsistencies in your patient charts." The hospital's chief medical officer entered then, flanked by legal counsel and an HR director. They'd been auditing Mercer's files for 3 days, following the same paper trail he'd built to destroy Megan. What they found didn't just contradict him, it shattered him piece by piece. A patient named Morrison who died from post-surgical infection. Mercer's notes claimed he administered prophylactic antibiotics. Pharmacy records proved they were never dispensed. He'd falsified the chart. Another patient, Chen, suffered complications from a dosage error. Mercer's notes blamed a nurse who'd already left her shift. The medication timestamp proved he was lying. Then another. Then another. The same meticulous documentation he'd weaponized against others was now a mirror held up to his own negligence. 17 incidents over 4 years. 17 falsified records. 17 people blamed for his mistakes. Each form signed with his name. Each lie notarized by his own hand. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately, the CMO said. The words fell like a judge's gavel. The state board will receive our full report. Mercer's face drained completely. You're destroying my career over a nurse who lied about her credentials. Captain O'Brien's credentials were verified by the Pentagon this morning, Patterson said, closing her folder with the finality of a coffin lid. She holds combat medical certifications that exceed your civilian training by approximately 8 years. She didn't lie. You just never asked. The walls closed in like a vice. Hospital privileges revoked. Malpractice insurance notified. Reputation collapsed under the weight of his own paperwork. The investigation he'd launched to bury Meghan had instead excavated his own grave, and now the bureaucratic machinery he'd perfected was grinding him into dust. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. Patterson stood to leave, and Mercer's voice cracked like old leather. What happens now? Mercer asked. Patterson didn't turn around. Now you teach CPR to teenagers, she said. And you remember that some people have already given everything to their country. You might want to think about what you've given to yours. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then the door closed, and Dr. Mercer sat alone at the conference table surrounded by his own confessions, each one stamped and filed and witnessed, each one a nail in a coffin he'd built himself. 1 week after Marcus carried the shadow box into the hospital, Meghan stood in the Oval Office wearing her dress uniform, the one she'd never thought she'd put on again, the one that hung in the back of her closet like a ghost. The uniform fit perfectly. Muscle memory knew exactly how to sit, how to stand, how to let her hands rest at her sides with the weight of purpose. The president pinned a new commendation to her chest, the recognition formal and public, for Operation Brass Summit, the mission that was classified for 2 years, the mission that officially never happened, the mission where she carried Davis 6 miles through enemy territory and saved 3 other soldiers the records couldn't acknowledge. Davis stood beside her in his own dress uniform, his shoulders back, his posture parade ground straight, the tattoo on his forearm visible to everyone watching. The Brian. Finally, not a secret. The cameras flashed like gunfire, and Meghan didn't flinch. She'd been photographed in combat zones. She'd been documented by Apache gun cameras. This felt easier. Marcus sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding why his mother woke at 0300 and ran until she couldn't think, why she'd kept a shadow box hidden in a closet, why she'd never told him that heroes sometimes push medication carts instead of carrying rifles. The statement went public within hours. Operation Brass Summit. Valkyrie 6. The classified disaster in the Hindu Kush that officially never happened was suddenly very much real, very much documented, very much a matter of record. News outlets ran the story with her photograph in uniform and in scrubs, the contrast sharp as a scalpel cut. Captain Meghan O'Brien. 12 years in the field. 2 silver stars. 3 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross. And for the last 8 months, a night shift nurse at Seattle General, catching medication errors and saving lives in room for 47 while a doctor tried to destroy her credentials on paper. The narrative wrote itself. The internet did what the internet does, it went viral and stayed viral, spreading like wildfire through medical forums and military communities and newsrooms that couldn't believe such a story was real. Other names surfaced. Other operators who'd served in silence. Other heroes in scrubs. The Pentagon's official statement was a paragraph long, but what it communicated was unmistakable. Captain O'Brien had been ordered to disappear after Brass Summit was compromised. She'd been legally dead in military databases. She'd rebuilt her entire life from scratch, ghost to ghost, with nothing but her hands and her training and her absolute refusal to stop saving lives. She'd done her job. In the field and in the hospital. And she'd done it perfectly while Dr. Mercer tried to murder her career with paperwork. Across town, in a community college building that smelled like old carpet and teenagers, Dr. Mercer stood before a CPR class and demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy. His hands went down into the mannequin's chest, 15 compressions, 2 breaths, rhythm unchanged from every other demonstration he'd given that semester. $15 an hour. No benefits. No status. No audience except bored high school students checking their phones between rounds. The MD from Johns Hopkins hanging on his apartment wall meant nothing without a license. The house in Buckhead would be sold within months to cover legal fees. His ex-wife, who'd stayed for the prestige, was already filing papers. His colleagues at Seattle General had stopped taking his calls. The medical community had a long memory for falsified charts and blamed patients. He was radioactive now, untouchable, a cautionary tale whispered in hospital lounges. The kids in his CPR class didn't know who he was. They didn't know he'd once commanded a unit, once published papers, once wielded authority like a weapon. They just knew he was a guy teaching them how to save lives, how to put hands on a chest and push down until the dummy's light turned green. One of them, a girl with tired eyes, raised her hand. "Why'd you start teaching this?" she asked. Mercer's hand stilled on the dummy's ribs. "Because someone showed me what happens when you waste the ability to help people," he said quietly. She nodded as if that made sense, then went back to her phone. The class continued. The dummy never complained. The compressions went deeper and deeper, and no one was watching. That night, Megan sat with Marcus in their apartment, the shadow box open on the coffee table between them. She unpacked the faded unit patch from her jacket lining, the one she'd cut from Davis's uniform that night in the mountains, the only piece of proof she'd kept that any of it had been real, and placed it with the other medals. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. The Navy Cross. And now, the Presidential Commendation, its ribbon so new it still had the crease from the presentation case. All of it together finally. All of it real. All of it witnessed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus asked, his voice still rough from crying. "Because I was ordered to disappear," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It never did. "And because I thought being your mom was enough." He shook his head, tears starting again. "You're always been enough," he said. "All of it. The soldier. The nurse. The mom. All of it." She reached over and squeezed his hand, and the silence between them was the kind that comes from understanding without words, the kind that holds everything that matters. Her phone buzzed. A text from Davis with a photograph, his forearm, the tattoo freshened and darkened, her name bold again. Underneath, he'd added 3 words in smaller script, Valkyrie 6, verified. She smiled for the first time since the Oval Office, and it was real. The bureaucratic machinery that had tried to destroy her had instead revealed the truth. The system that should have buried her had excavated her instead, brought her from the shadows into the light, made her real in ways she'd never expected. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer hiding. And somewhere in Atlanta, on the campus of a community college, a man who'd tried to weaponize paperwork against her was learning in real time what it meant to face the consequences of his own documentation. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. But when that person finally speaks, when that person's identity finally emerges from the classified shadows, the world stops and listens. And in the listening, in the witnessing, the truth settles into place like a scar that's finally allowed to heal. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another moment when the world learns who's really been holding it all together. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And if you want more stories of hidden heroes, tap like and we'll see you in the next one.